share that view of the majority. So I'm going to stand in the middle here and introduce the teams. And the way this is going to work is each team will put their first speaker forward, who will have 4 minutes to either oppose or propose the motion. The other side will get 4 minutes. Then the other speaker in each team will have 4 minutes. The two teams will then have 3 minutes to respond to what the other sides have just said. I'll then throw it open to you in the audience for some to throw questions at specific panelists or both teams, and then each team will have 3 minutes to sum up at the end. The motion today, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands on this before we start. So the winning team will be the team that moves the centre of gravity in the room, as opposed to actually winning the debate per se. Oxford Style Debate. This House believes that investors and bankers, not politicians or social movements, are the best hope for avoiding climate disaster. And the side in favour of that motion is Lisa Ashford, Chief Executive Officer of Ethex, and Mark Campanale, who, among other things, is founder of Carbon Tracker. Those opposing the motion are Matthew Spencer, who's Policy and Campaigns Director at Oxfam, and Lutfey Siddiqi, who is Visiting Professor in Practice at London School of Economics. So which of you two is going to go first to propose the motion? Lisa, I would ask you to stand up maybe to speak, and just to give you a bit more energy at this point, and feel free to walk around or whatever. And, okay. So you have 4 minutes starting from now.
Okay, so first let me just say, if we're depending on the politicians to do absolutely anything, then we're going to find ourselves in a complete predicament. The Conservative government has completely dismantled green policies, and Trump is doing exactly the same thing in the States.
Sorry, I didn't do the show of hands. Well pointed out. I'm going to stop the clock. You had 30 seconds, but I will stop the clock here and quickly ask for the show of hands. All those in favour of the motion raise their hands, so that the investors and bankers are the best hope. All those against the motion, I think the politicians. I would say it was about 60-40. Would you accept that as in favour of the motion? Yeah. Okay. So you now have another 3.5 minutes. Do you want to start again? I'll give you the full 4 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
So 30. Okay. 4 minutes starting from now.
All right. So first let me start by saying if we're relying on the politicians to do anything at the moment, we'll end up in a complete predicament. Conservative government has completely dismantled green policies, and Trump is doing the same in the States, and this is a complete disaster in terms of climate change. So in terms of social movements, well, they're generally talking about not doing anything, and I would suggest that in this case it requires real action. So saying divest is a great campaign, but actually we need to be reinvesting as well as divesting. Now, talking about money, money is one of the most powerful ways in which you can make change in the world, and your dollar is actually spending it is one of the most important ways you can. Fair trade is a movement which has been predominantly pushed forward by people actually putting their dollar towards it. Organic food and Share Action is doing a brilliant job of encouraging people to, as investors, to think about taking action and using their money to make change. When we're talking about this, we need to look at demand and supply. And in terms of the demand, we've heard today that there's quite a lot of demand out there, but actually we also heard that females and millennials are possibly some of those with the greatest potential in moving forward. And there's a huge education gap there, so that needs to be filled if we really want to create change. On the supply side, financial services are not providing the products that we really need in order to advance the movement in climate change. So there needs to be a lot more movement there. So when we're thinking about this, we need to think about the what, the who, and the how. The what, financial services are going to provide the solutions, but they need to provide the products. We're talking about current accounts, we're talking about ISAs, we're talking about investment products. The who, we're talking about women and millennials who are going to make vast changes when that income and that investment is going to come to them in years to come. And the how, Do we think that these people are going to be using wealth managers and traditional forms of finance? I suggest not. I think they're going to be using apps. They're going to be using their screens to make decisions. They're going to be using artificial intelligence. So yes, banks and the financial institutions do have the solution, but they have to be completely transformed to provide the services that we need in order to provide the solution to climate change.
Okay, thank you very much. Round of applause for the first speaker, please. Okay, I'm going to hand over to the other side. Lutfey, you're going first. You have 4 minutes starting from now.
Okay, thank you. So this is such a non-debate in many ways. I feel a bit like, get the visual of George W. Bush declaring mission accomplished on that aircraft carrier. So really, is it bankers and private investors that are more important than social movements and non-profits and representatives of the people? I looked at the affiliations of the two members on the side opposite, and they're both non-profits. I wonder why we need them if the bankers are really more pious than the Pope. We do need the Pope, and he is on our side of the debate, but I think we've got to be careful here. I read about this company issuing a large green bond recently, just a couple of days ago, $1 billion of principal. Market cap of that company is $800 billion. Cash that they're holding, $249 billion. And they've just issued $1 billion in social bonds because they want to make their supply chain more environmentally sustainable. Specifically, they want to invest in this company that's going to make it easier for people to extract metals from their phones. So 249 days of the year, they're going to build these phones that'll make it difficult to extract metals out of, and one day of the year, they're going to invest in this wonderful fund to make it easy to extract it out of. So let's be careful here. Good is the new cool. Let's not fall for tokenism. It's quite typical. It's like saying that the shoplifter has agreed not to burgle between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. on a Monday. So let's get rid of the policeman. Let's get rid of the prison because mission accomplished. Enron environmentalism, or greenwashing, as somebody mentioned earlier on. A leading asset manager said this quite recently, that they're trying to, they have a fund, they want to invest in a green fund. 25% of self-styled green investments didn't meet the bar. They were just, didn't meet the standards. So we need non-profits. We need these movements to keep us in the straight and narrow and to be standard setters. Now, it's not all bad, obviously. There's BlackRock doing a tremendous amount of work, ESG governance, and so on and so forth. You read their reports, and at the end of all these reports, it's policy prescriptions. It's like we need parental action to get us kids to do any work. It's always, how do we crowd in private capital? How does public capital crowd in private capital? It's never the other way around. I mean, do you have the board of Barclays sitting there saying, how are we going to tackle climate change and crowd in these social activists and these politicians? It's hardly ever in that direction. So, look, there's genuine market failure over here. Two types of market failure, at least two types. One is that emissions, by definition, are externalities, and it's just not possible for agents inside of the market to internalize those externalities. And secondly, there's a coordination failure. Sainsbury's will only act if Tesco's act first. And Tesco's will act first if the government has a climate policy certainty framework in there. And neither of them will work unless Catherine from Share Action goes there and makes them do this. So it's absurd to say that Tesco's are the heroes and the protagonists over here. I'm going to stop here, and I'll come back hopefully later on, but I'll hand it over to the apologists now for their arguments.
Thank you very much. So, Mark, the gauntlet's been thrown down. You have 4 minutes starting from now.
Well, last time I looked, it's not illegal to burn fossil fuels, the biggest contribution to climate change. And policymakers and governments and citizens have known about climate for many years, particularly policymakers going into the Earth Summit in 1992. And yet we know that 80% of the fossil fuels have to remain in the ground to stay below 2 degrees. And based on current emissions trajectories, we're going to be through this carbon budget within about 30 years. And you're asking us to believe that we can convince hundreds of governments and millions of citizens to make tiny incremental changes, even voting, that suddenly will solve this huge problem. And yet when we look at the world of capital, we know that we can put the 30 to 40 bankers and the people who run the pension schemes and the Norwegian government sovereign wealth fund, we can take the leadership of the banking community, the heads of the Goldman Sachs and our great friends at Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, and we can say to them, well, let's change how we think about this. It's not illegal to be a coal company or an oil company, but it doesn't mean we have to invest in them. It doesn't mean we have to write new checks to expand the fossil fuel economy. And obviously it's well known that each year hundreds of billions go into subsidizing the fossil fuel economy by governments, supported by politicians, supported by citizen voters. I think OECD priced it at $500 billion a year goes into subsidies, supported by governments and policymakers. And yet, when we turn to the capital markets, this year we know, in the last year, more money has been deployed, and is being deployed by private capital into expanding clean energy than into supporting the fossil fuel economy. Trump has tried to subsidize and benefit the fossil fuel economy, and yet investors are not writing the checks. And this is because they've begun to reprice the risk. Now, how have they started to reprice the risk? Well, if you looked at what happened in the Earth Summit, it was business, and then there were the NGOs, and then there were science people and policymakers, and governments had their ears bent by business. And when they talked to business, they often meant, well, you know, and it meant business are the bankers and the investors. And so the business world managed to persuade governments to rein back, which is why Copenhagen was a disaster. We wasn't a great success. And so looking at this, my own little non-profit carbon tracker, we said, well, let's divide this group called business, because the interest of the banking community and the fund management community is not the same as the interests of business or in the interests of citizens. If we can persuade the bankers and the pension funds to get on side with communities and citizens, then we can begin to turn the tide. And so in Paris this year, using this idea of unburnable carbon and stranded assets, the investors go, well, look, why should we be putting money into supporting the fossil fuel economy when we can be changing direction and changing course? And so the bankers arrived in Paris in force, and groups like Share Action with their allies amongst the pension funds began to change the narrative. And we succeeded to change the story. And then the divestment community kicked in. Well, why would the divestment community be focusing, the hundreds of students, be focusing on persuading pension funds to divest if they didn't know that money is where the power is? Why would they even bother each time to come back? And so what they've done is they've persuaded trustees and pension funds, who then have to nag their fund managers at Hermes and LGIM and all the others to look at repricing the risk, which is what they've begun to do. And they've stopped repricing. They stopped sending the checks to these companies. Coal India did a tour of Europe to raise new money in the Indian government's sale of Coal India, and the pension fund said, well, we're going to say pass to this because the future isn't going to be coal, it's going to be renewable energy. And my first report at Carbon Tracker was actually to the Bank of England and Mark Carney. I had my hour of fame presenting to the task force, or the Financial Stability Board that then set up the task force on climate risk. Now the regulators are beginning to change the story with how financial markets are regulated. And if we look at where the power is, that's where we can get the change.
Matt, you have 4 minutes starting from now.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to tell you two stories that illustrate the points that Lutfey made about how we've made change happen that has already reduced our emissions. I'm going to take one small country, the UK. Let's start a mile up the road. A mile up the road at Holborn Viaduct was the world's first public coal-fired power station. It was built in 1882. The UK was dependent on coal-fired power for every day and every year since that, until this year, until April the 21st, when we had the first day in the UK where no coal-fired power electricity was used at all. How did we get to that result? It was the result of 2 or 3 different things, all of which social movements and governments were central to. It started with the big move against acid rain in the 1980s, where European governments, particularly activist governments in Scandinavia, forced other European governments to control SOx and NOx pollution from those power stations using regulation. It was followed up by the intervention of liberal economists and politicians and the liberalisation of that market, which broke the stranglehold of coal and introduced gas to the UK market. It was then followed up with an enormous effort to get to a formal phase out of coal in the UK. I was part of the effort by development and environmental NGOs. We sat to get that phase out agreed. We sat round the cabinet table with David Cameron and persuaded him that he had a de facto phase out and that it would do no harm. In fact, it would be good to announce that as a formal policy. We convinced him not on the economics, not on the investment case. We convinced him on the moral case. And that's why Oxfam, who I represent, have been campaigning for 5-10 years on climate change, because climate change is the biggest barrier to ending poverty in the world. There are 13 million people at this moment in South Sudan, Somalia, northern Kenya, at extreme risk of starvation. They are suffering almost 3 years without rain, a super El Nino, which climate change is exacerbating. So it's the moral case which is invariably stimulated and championed by social movements, which politics adopts and investors can then creatively exploit. The story of coal is social movements creating the space, governments setting the rules, and investors then changing their decisions. We are not investing in the upgrading of those coal-fired power stations anymore because the rules make it unattractive. The second story is about renewable energy. When I started working in renewable energy 20 years ago, it provided 2% of the UK's electricity. There was a period last week where it provided 50% of the UK's electricity. That was driven by policy in Germany, China, and the UK, driven by social movements in the first and last of those countries, and by government policy in the middle one. We've now got to tackling climate change is a team sport, and we all play different roles in that. The social movements create the space for political rules to be set and policy rules to be set that investors can exploit, commercialize technology, bring down prices, and raise ambition again for those social movements and for politics. That's why the motion should not carry.
Thank you. So you guys now have between you 3 minutes to respond to what you've heard and to sharpen your arguments. You can split the time between you if you like, or one of you just speak.
I'll go first, briefly.
Okay, you have 3 minutes starting from now.
Despite what you've said, I think the time has shown that relying on politicians and governments to create a stable investment environment is just not happening. So what's been created is a huge amount of regulatory risk for investors and financial institutions. So if we're relying on the governments to set the policy, then I just don't feel that there's enough stability and a long enough time horizon to best inform those types of investment decisions. So actually, I think it's everyday investors, it's the financial institutions that have to create the opportunities and go ahead and try and solve this problem without or disregarding the sort of political agenda.
Matthew, your arguments that the rules that made coal unattractive, actually it was the actions of hundreds of investors around the world investing in clean technologies, particularly solar, that made it cheaper, that has outcompeted coal. Obviously, regulation is going to help, but I can't see how, if solar hadn't been cheaper, why would it be deployed? And it was the role of investors in scaling up and accelerating the deployment of solar technologies that's helped to beat coal. Now, on the same day that Trump pulled out the States from the Paris Agreement was the very same week that the shareholders in Exxon, 62% of them led by groups like BlackRock and Vanguard, called on, essentially on Exxon to fess up and accept that the game was up with the fossil fuel industry, and it was the action of the church groups and groups like Share Action and others to persuade the investors that the game was up on Exxon. You can't continue to expand as an industry. That wasn't government action. That was enlightened progressive investors representing their clients, forcibly arguing the case, not just of Exxon, but all the others as well, Shell and BP and the challenges on at Glencore and others. So that's the reason why we can't wait for governments to move. The reason why people are going to support our side of this argument is because they can see action happening with investors whilst politicians are still whistling for it.
Excellent. So, well done. So you guys, between you now have 3 minutes to respond to Mark's excellent points and Lisa's excellent points. Starting from, let's give it 5 more seconds. Starting from now.
So enlightenment doesn't happen, you know, you get a vision and voila, from today I'm enlightened. So clearly there's a groundswell of social movement that leads to that point. But it's also a case of enlightened self-interest being a necessary but not a sufficient condition. I just mentioned the scale in response to the everyday activity, the bad impact activity that all of these people engage in. Somebody mentioned how so much money has been deployed in this space. Capital markets, green markets doubled in the last 2 years, which is true, but more than a third of that is China, that great bastion of free market laissez-faire capitalism with no government intervention at all. I know that Trump's withdrawal from the climate agreement, it's a coping mechanism to say that private investors will take care of it. Actually, the leadership that's being provided right now is the governor of California, the mayor of Pittsburgh. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's not your Jamie Dimon who stepped up and said, this is what I'm going to be doing. So, look, I'd much rather rely on the political forces and governments and parliaments than on the vagaries of Elon Musk, who might decide one day to be on the council and the other day not to be on the council, or where interest rates are. It's a zero interest rate environment right now. Everybody's looking at impact because it's quite cool, and the alternative is negative rates. Who knows where rates will be tomorrow and where you might change? So, no, thank you very much.
You've still got a minute and a half to go.
That's okay, we'll take it at the end.
I'm not sure you get that option, but anyway, a big round of applause for those guys. Thank you. So, you've heard arguments on both sides. Anyone want to come in with a question or argument either way to the panelists? Who'd like to jump into this debate? Over there, we've got a gentleman. There's a microphone will come to you. Please say who you are and who you want to direct your question at.
I'm Tristram Stewart, Feedback, an environmental organisation responsible for having catalysed a movement against food waste. There's been a lot of example giving of how business can help combat climate change, and the energy transition is the one that is constantly wheeled out, and obviously the energy transition is precisely the area in which business can solve that particular problem, which is one part of climate change, and climate change is one part of the environmental disaster. No examples have been given of how business is going to arrest the rapid demolition of the world's remaining forests, because it's clear that the only way in which business can really make big capital out of it, and is doing so increasingly quickly, is by turning the wood into toilet paper and the land into soy fields. And business is not, realistically, within 5 or 20 years, going to tackle that problem. You need government interaction. Talk about those environmental issues that business is not currently solving, rather than the few examples, like energy transition, where it obviously is.
The ball's in your court, Mark and Lisa. How do you reply to that one?
Forests are clearly important. They make up a reasonable proportion of emissions, land-based emissions, land use change. But for me, it's the fossil fuel industry and the burning of fossil fuels is the one that we can tackle. Something like 40 to 50% of fossil fuels actively traded in the market at any one time is backed by private investors and banks, and that's the group that we can deal with. In the case of deforestation, obviously there's companies and consumers that are involved in consuming palm oil and then moving on to beef, which deforests. And there's still companies involved in that. I think what I'm really calling for is investors holding companies to account, both for how their strategies they deploy, which is why the shareholder resolutions at Exxon were so important, but also funding the new economy and the energy transition. And that's the reason why I argue so persuasively for capital. I don't think
it doesn't sound like you have an answer to his question.
No, because I don't think his question is do you like red or you don't like red, was essentially what the point you were making. And it's actually more than whether red fits.
Today, I think we heard from quite a motivational CEO at Danone who talked about incorporating a social mission into every element of their organisation. And actually, as a CEO, he was clearly driven by a number of different factors, and his personal bonus was dependent on a number of factors. And I think having those case studies and being able to reference those is just the beginning. But then also we talked very briefly earlier about small organisations and SMEs, which make up a huge part of the economy as well. And there are many, many social businesses, mission-driven businesses who are tackling social problems or actually just have a social purpose at the very heart of the business.
Okay, let's take another. Don't want to give too much time. I think particularly any criticisms of Lutfey and Matt would be good.
It was just a point leading on, if that's okay.
Just say who you are.
Okay, hi, I'm Mahadasaya, researcher, Imperial. Just touching upon the point you made and the point you made about social impact. Yes, a lot of big companies like Danone, let's put Danone aside, let's say Nestle is focusing on water as one of the SDGs. It makes you wonder why a food company would want to focus on water. You have to kind of think about the intentionality. Maybe, of course, some businesses are able to tackle some social elements, but why are they doing it? Are they doing it?
So you're questioning the motives.
So my question is the intentionality of business as good as the intentionality of government or NGOs when looking at actually creating change?
Okay, we've got some more comments back there. Let's, someone with the white shirt on at the back. Rod.
Yeah. Hi, Rod Schwartz, clearly. So every time I think my faith in government sinks about as low as it can, events prove me to have been too optimistic. And I quite support the power of investors, which is really the question. On the other hand, I sometimes wonder if investors would be as motivated as they are without social movements. So I'm challenging the question a bit.
Well, let's ask Team Trump first. You're on the side of the politicians solving this problem. What do you think?
I would suggest that our job is not to convince you that government's always good. It's the other side's job to convince you that investors and banks are more important than anybody else in solving this problem. Our view is that all of those actors are important to solving the problems. And we don't have to, we'd probably agree we need better government, but we have to have social movements creating the space, creating the pressure for either politicians to get out of bed, to turn the important into the urgent, or for the market frameworks and incentives to be created whereby investors can invest safely.
We have a question here.
Arthur Wood from Total Impact Capital. I put it to you that when you look at this historically, that it's always been the bankers that have driven the process. If you look at the rise of the church before 1307, it was the creation of the Templars that created checkbooks, letters of credit, the first multinational corporation. If you look at the rise of the Renaissance, it was a surplus capital that was thrown up by the creation of the bond market. If you look at why France lost to the UK, it was because it had an efficient banking system. If you look at Bretton Woods is the dominance of the American system. We've now reached a critical point in terms of probably the bankruptcy of that system, and it is only the bankers pricing the externalities that will create this change, exactly the same as they've done for the last 1,000 years.
So, Lutfey, you're a historian.
I raise you the anti-slavery movement. I raise you the campaign to get women's votes. I raise you the campaign to get equal marriage. The banks were not involved in any of those.
Well, they were in the slavery movement. Arthur, do you want to come back on that? And then
No,
we'll
I want to respond to this point about on the slavery one. It was the inability of the slave traders to get insurance on their boats that was one of the things that killed the slave trade. Let's be correct about the history. It was the politicians debated anti-slavery for hundreds of years, as you well know. It was actually the insurers industry that decided not to insure boats that couldn't go outside the waters that were carrying slaves that ended in the slave industry. So let's be correct on that one.
Yeah, another point here.
Just a quick reminder. I think the best chance of avoiding a planetary car crash is by following the COP process. And the COP process was entirely government, policy, local volunteerism, local action.
Yeah, your beloved Paris really wins this side of the argument. Mark, or not?
Well, the volunteerism.
Well, the politicians did the COP21.
Yeah, my point was that when the politicians saw clearly that the financial sector was coming in behind a climate deal, and it was groups of big institutional investors forcibly turning up and saying, look, Bob Dylan was right. Money doesn't just talk, it shouts. And was very good at speaking to the politicians. And finally, the politicians had some wiggle room. They were saying, well, listen, if the investors who at the end of the day own your companies wants a deal, who are you as a mere management member of a company to go against what your shareholders are saying? And that's one of the reasons why, why we had a successful Paris Agreement in the sense of everyone agreeing together on a way forward.
Any more comments? The women have been quite quiet during this debate. Here we are. Turn that around. The mic's coming to you. Do say who you are.
My name is Meltem. I'm from the EBRD, European Bank, so it's a government-funded institution. The question is it really possible to differentiate between banks and politicians any longer, and media in any event? So is this debate completely false?
In what sense? Just elaborate a bit more.
Well,
they're all untrustworthy.
Well, that's one part, perhaps. But the other thing is, it's just so interchangeable. Today you're the politician, next day you are the, whatever, Goldman Sachs. I mean, it's just completely interchangeable. So, we think we're voting for the politicians. We think we're voting for social policies, change, whatnot. Ultimately, it's the capital that is defining that. So there's a revolving door, so to speak, and then basically it's hand in glove, and both sides of the debate are. It's again farce.
So both sides. The finance industrial complex means the debate's irrelevant.
Well, I clearly don't think so. Particularly here in the UK, climate change is not a political debate anymore. It's a resolved issue. We have the best policy framework for companies to operate in, and I would suppose that it's a result of the political process, the lobbying process, the social movement, which is behind the fact that it is a settled issue. I think the dilemma always is, look, finance is a tremendous force. Can be a force for good, it's a tremendous force. It's resources that are required. There's no question about it. The scale of resources required, you've got to get mainstream finance into it. So it's an ecosystem, we need everybody. But if you're going to say that in the sequencing of it, it's private investors and banks that are more important, then I'm afraid it's just not true. It's a no contest. Cavalry needs horses, but you don't lead the horses with other horses. You need Wonder Woman and other generals to lead the charge, and that's the case over here. We'll still need to deploy capital, but you just can't rely on the captains of capital to do that leading for you.
Okay, well, our time is almost up, so you each now have 2 minutes closing remarks to finally swing the audience your way. So those in favour of the motion get to go first. You have 2 minutes between you to sum up and explain why you should win.
I would love to think that governments will run as fast as they can to get the change that we need in the limited time that we've got. And my firm view is that we can mobilise the owners of capital to address the climate challenge before we can mobilise governments to do that, due to inertia and vested interests over government. And the alliances that we've seen built, particularly around the shareholder resolution against Exxon and Shell and BP and the others, which are now in the majority, showed us how quickly you can build alliances whilst people in the political process are faffing around. So I think that where we need to get to is the fossil fuel industry to essentially agree to wind itself down. Governments are not going to ask for that. Consumers may, but they may have to whistle. Whereas the owners of those companies can get companies to begin to put in place those 2-degree business plans, which is what we're beginning to see being published now by companies like Total and the others, is to align their businesses. And it's not, the pressure is not coming from governments, the pressure is coming from the shareholders. And marvelously, this new group, these financial regulators and the accountants. And what I'm arguing, which is why you should support our case, is that it's our ability to move quickly and with force of action that shows how the approach of private capital can win before governments have even got out of bed, or even governments change and you're having to deal with a whole new group. In fact, we've got a new climate minister announced today. You know, how can we handle that when we've got institutional investors that will be in place year in and year out, essentially changing the course of direction for companies? And Hermes published a great essay today on their website about the role of institutional investors around climate. Go away and read it, because we've got lessons to learn there, which is why I think you should support our side of the debate in this resolution.
You guys have 2 minutes, starting from now.
So, listening to one of the panels earlier, and I was wondering, why is it that Goldman Sachs didn't come up with the social finance bond? They have the expertise, they have the ability to do it. You needed a separately created entity to come up with that. Or the other panel that had multiple global heads of responsibility as the titles on the panel. And I was thinking, if that's the title, does that mean every other departmental head in those organizations are global heads of irresponsibility? I think that is the implication, that you've got this sort of clean bit over here and everything else is dirty. Look, if you have to think about how do executive committees and boards work within these companies, you need a lot of external pressure just to get buy-in within the executive team, within the board, to get action on some of these. And that pressure comes from social movements, from government, from regulations, and so on and so forth. And so we help the entrepreneurs by being pace setters and accelerants from the outside through the social movement. As I've said before, just because the poacher promises to stop poaching for a day, you don't make him the gamekeeper. Thank you.
You still have a minute if you want to use it.
Well, I mean, I think the other side have had a very difficult job of convincing you that finance on its own will do everything we need to be done. As I say, change is a team sport. Social movements need you, the investors, to deliver into the space that can be created. And I think we'd agree we all need better government.
Great. Thank you very much. So, a round of applause to both sides. Some good cut and thrust there. So, I want to see a show of hands. Those of you who are in favour of the motion that bankers and investors are the best hope to avert a climate crisis. Let's see your hands today. And those who are against the motion. I think that this side has managed to move some opinion across. So the faffing about Trump's side has won, and the bankers and the accountants have lost. But a good effort on all sides. Thank you very much. And now, for our final keynote to end the day, I hand over to Andrew and Prince Max.